We like to think neurodiversity includes everyone, but in practice, some neurodivergent communities are unintentionally left out. As the movement grows, I'm seeing a pattern. The same shield that protects and expands rights for some can also become a barrier for others. In this episode, I explore how that happens and why we must be intentional if we want to achieve true neuroinclusion and ensure no one gets left behind. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Many years ago, I was at a conference in a room full of human resource officers. I'd been invited to join a diversity leadership roundtable. When it was my turn to speak, I completely derailed my prepared talk because I had just spent an entire day listening to conversations about diversity and inclusion without one single mention of disability. Not once. And certainly nothing about neuroinclusion. Now, at the time, my focus was more on autism inclusion specifically, but before I could even go there, I had to stop the room. I said, we need to have a hard conversation. I wasn't angry for sport, but I was frustrated because this gap was glaringly obvious to me and apparently invisible to everyone else. So instead of delivering my prepared marks, I looked around the room at HR leaders from CVS, Walmart, Bridgestone, major players with massive influence, and I asked the question that had been building in my mind all day. I looked at them and said, when you say diversity, who exactly are you talking about? Who are you really striving to include? Because I'm concerned that when you say diversity and I say diversity, we're not talking about the same things. And then I waited. This wasn't a rhetorical question. I wanted real answers. How dare we be at a diversity leadership summit, and until my moment, no one had even brought up disability, let alone neurodivergence. How was I supposed to engage in a meaningful conversation about autism inclusion when the people in front of me, with all the power to make the change, didn't have it on their radar? The truth is, it's easy to say we're inclusive as if that covers everyone, as if vague intention equals equitable results. But the way we approach our work, our systems, our training, our focus, usually tells a different story. Our energy often goes towards certain groups, while others remain invisible. So first, we fought for years to be part of the diversity table, and disability advocates like me were always a side topic. And now that DEI is under attack, we're being included. Thanks so much for the late invite now that no one wants to come to the party. And yes, the landscape has changed. Not only are people hesitant to talk about how to better help marginalized people with promise, there's also a shift from where I started talking publicly in the late 2010s to how we talk now. When I first started talking about autism inclusion, that was before this concept of neurodiversity. And then more and more as time went on, neurodiversity became the center of focus. We started to realize that neurodivergents had similar accommodation needs, especially in the workplace. And concepts like psychological safety and having a competent, empathetic, and adaptive leader was the starting point. Neurodiversity is a much-needed macro-level concept that includes many, many groups beneath it. Big brushstrokes cover more area, but over time, we lose nuance in our craft. Large covers are great in rainstorms, but do little for the specific needs of the individuals underneath it. I'm concerned that some groups may be getting lost in the crowd, and others, maybe worse, have been thrown into a category and concept and have yet to get their own full seat at the table. Saying hello to my Tourette's friends today. So here I am, almost a decade later, asking a question I never imagined I'd be asking about the neurodiversity movement. But here I am, sitting, reflecting on something that troubles me deeply. I want to discuss how important it is that I ask you, my listener, and especially my advocate friends, when you say neurodiversity, who are you really talking about? Who's actually included? I can already imagine pushback on this conversation, but I really want you to listen and to pause, as I'm pausing, to do an honest reflection on the work we're doing. It's okay to have a specialty. We all need that specific focus. We need micro-level supports and macro-level change. That is why neurodiversity is such a powerful movement. The macro-level changes, for the most part, can be done holistically across the group. But the day-to-day supports, the manager-to-employee interactions, the teacher-to-student level engagement, often there are micro-level changes and knowledge that is needed. And I'm sorry, I firmly stand behind, generic nuance doesn't fully cover. So while neurodiversity covers all neurodivergence, I think it's really important to be reminded that a single neurodivergence does not represent all neurodiversity. Autism isn't ADHD. ADHD isn't dyslexia. And dyslexia isn't Tourette's syndrome. What about giftedness? What about learning differences? They're all forms of neurodivergence. And I'm finding we have a one-way equation that is being treated like a two-way equation, and it's not. So yes, autism is a neurodivergence. That is a true statement. But neurodivergence isn't autism. You don't have to like what I've said out loud, but neurodivergence is a generic macro-level term. So when someone says, I'm neurodivergent, they really haven't told you a whole lot. And by the way, I think that's the point. Saying I'm neurodivergent allows enough ambiguity that it reduces the bias and assumptions people would make more easily if you just said, I have ADHD or I have Tourette's. There is power in having a tool that describes a person or yourself vaguely, that gives a hint that my brain works differently, but not enough information to actually know how differently. If someone introduces themselves to me as neurodivergent, it gives me awareness that they're not neurotypical, and that's about it. I will have to listen, watch, or dare say ask for more information to know if there's anything specific they need me to know. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe we are purposely creating a cloud to effectively navigate the world with less exposure and ultimately less risk. And here's the thing. This flattening, it didn't happen by accident. When the concept of neurodiversity first started to take root, it was a rallying point for the autism advocacy community. It was about changing the conversation from fixing people to valuing them. And the more we talked about autism-inclusive constructs, the more we appreciated, publicly, that other neurodivergencies needed the same supports too. As more groups rightfully saw themselves in the concept, the umbrella got bigger. And this growth and shift is good in so many ways. And it opened the door for so many more to be part of the active conversation. But over time, I can see the balance is shifting. Autism was once the dominant voice in the conversation, so much so that people would complain. Autism isn't all neurodivergence. Now, ADHD is everywhere in the neurodiversity space, especially online and on the big stages. And autism, the condition that morphed during my time as a practitioner to bring more similar conditions all together, is becoming more segmented. With a realization that late diagnosis, childhood diagnosis, and affect levels are creating a need for nuance in these conversations. Can a level 1 late diagnosed autistic effectively speak to parents raising a level 3 autist? There is some debate here, but actually the reality leans towards no. And giftedness and neurodivergence, and therefore related to other neurodistinctions, isn't the same as the others. And what happened to all of those with learning differences? And what of the conditions like Tourette's that barely get any airtime at all? So here's where the shift gets complicated. Neurodiversity as a concept, and I'm talking about the broad idea, not the buzzword, started with the intention of all brains belong. That was the baseline. Human variation in thinking, processing, sensing, learning. None of it inherently wrong or broken. But as it moved from a grassroots idea into workplaces, schools, and the conference circuit, something happened. It morphed to fit the narrative people could accept and digest. The forms of neurodiversity that we discuss with organizations have had to become more palatable. Educators have to take a bigger bite out of the apple out of requirements, but organizations can opt out. So making it a macro-level concept and focusing on systems and not conditions made it easier for organizational leaders and educators to understand and, more importantly, accept. However, with wider acceptance usually means a bit of loss along the way. And I believe we have great macro-level ideas, much needed for systemic change. But at the same time, nuance is getting stripped away. Instead of digging into the complexity of multiple conditions, each with different needs, we started to use the umbrella term almost as a shield, a way to say, look how inclusive we are, without actually wrestling with the harder, messier parts of our own family. We have to focus on the possibilities and positives, or we won't gain entry into the mainstream. But that also means even in this movement to support neuroinclusion for all, there are some that are still too different from the median of neurodivergence to be part of the conversation too. That's a lot to digest. But it's a truth we need to be willing to hear, because if we don't acknowledge it, we can't address it. And here's where my own recent experience hit me hard. I was invited to be part of a neurodiversity learning panel, and I thought, great, diverse perspectives, different disciplines, multiple conditions represented. They said neurodiversity, but when I got the panel lineup, every single other speaker was ADHD, and every single one was there as a lived experience voice. No researchers, no strategists, no one speaking from a systems or organizational change lens, no other view into other neurodivergencies except me. I was concerned that perhaps I misread the original ask, and I said, is this an ADHD panel, which is fine, or a neurodiversity panel? And they responded, no, we want this to be about neurodiversity. That's why we're so glad you will be here, which is great, but also concerning to me. Now, I respect lived experience deeply. I am lived experience from multiple perspectives regarding multiple neurodivergencies. Lived experience informs the problem statement the best. And where I don't have personal experience, I have friends or family that I talk to that have other conditions. And then there's the intentional outreach and the research to learn more. I remember when the field was dominated by autistic voices just a few years ago. And as I said, there were criticisms because that didn't reflect the full scope of neurodiversity. Yet here we are swinging the pendulum the other way. This isn't balance. This is just replacing one narrow conversation with another. But what concerns me the most is when you zoom out, you see a hierarchy emerge. While school systems are legally bound to prioritize services for students with the highest support needs, neurodiversity efforts in the workplace often flip that script. In corporate settings, attention and resources frequently center first on conditions perceived as easier to accommodate and more relatable. This isn't about prevalence or importance. It reflects a comfort-driven hierarchy that shapes who gets included and how quickly. Not because those are the people that need the most support, but because that's where the media interest, workplace training comfort level, and social momentum happen to be. There is a trend that we want to be neuroinclusive, but also you can't be too neurodivergent and still fit in and work here. And here's the risk. Outcomes are the result of intention. And if our intention is misunderstood, ill-defined, then we won't achieve the desired outcome. I started working to achieve autism inclusion before autism was made a broad spectrum diagnosis, before the term neurodiversity was in our regular vernacular. And now I'm concerned that the very people I have been working so hard to find solutions for, who were the catalyst for the great changes that others are reaping, are somehow now being left behind again. So my ask is to be intentional. If you're talking about neurodiversity, it needs to be about everyone from a systems level, and it needs to use constructs that can really help the majority of the neurodivergent population. Because honestly, even within our own space, we have folks so impacted that generalized approaches still won't work. And if you're all about Tourette's syndrome, then be all about Tourette's. If you're all about ADHD, then be all about ADHD. And if you are all about late diagnosed autism, then be all in on that and how it informs the neurodiversity movement. But please don't try to flip the equation because it doesn't work. And in time, it will do more harm than good. The truth is, every single one of these groups and populations needs support. Every single one has barriers in education, employment, and daily life. But not one of them alone represents the whole. When we forget that, we don't just leave people out. We actually build systems that unintentionally reinforce exclusion. So yes, using the umbrella term neurodiversity and neuroinclusion can help open the door to conversations. It can feel safer, more palatable. It's even trendier. But if we're not careful, it becomes a false promise. It makes us feel like we've covered everyone when we've just put a new label on the same selective inclusion problem we've always had. So if we're serious about this neuroinclusion movement, we have to work like an accordion, zooming out for the macro systemic changes that benefit them more, and then zooming back in for the micro condition specific needs. That's the only way to honor both the breadth and the depth of the neurodiversity movement. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Work Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.